of you went to Buddy Guy's Blues Club last night? What hope do we have? Pleasure to be here. You know, we're here talking about a river. And we talk about the river from the perspectives that we individually or organizationally have. If you hindcast a little bit, you realize that Sal Marquette first saw the river Europeanized for the first time. They were introduced to the Father of Waters. Not something that a legal system governing. Oh, certainly there were people who used it, and they would squabble over it, but we didn't need a definition of what a river was. It was apparent. The river had high periods, low periods. Times it was your friend, there were times it was your foe. And you learned to live with it and depend upon it. That's largely the river that our country came to. It was understood as vitally important. It was the reason for the Louisiana Purchase. Why it was about New Orleans as the keystone. But it was about controlling a river that controlled a continent. The legal regimes that the Europeans brought with them also didn't bother defining what a river was. They didn't need to, because the rivers that we had experienced through French, Spanish, and English tradition, largely you owed your downstream neighbor the same river you had received. It's called the natural flow doctrine under English law. You wouldn't have needed a Clean Water Act if that were still the law, because you would owe your downstream neighbor the same river you received. We've changed those legal approaches because we're a very legalistic society. And we also wanted to make sure that we had the capacity to develop. Because you can't have mills, and you can't have commerce, and you can't have most of the things we associate with a working society if your waters are essentially as nature provided them to you. However, as we moved into that more controlled, world where states, by the way, controlled water. So a river that goes through, draws water from 31 states is essentially 31 state laws, overlaying now with a suite of federal laws and tribal laws and some treaty laws. So it's no longer the river nature gave us. It's the river that we have interpreted through a series of perhaps well-intended, but often just historically rooted perspectives on who should have water and who shouldn't and what you can use it for. Now, we still talk about it as though it's the river. We talk about Mark Twain's river. We talk about the river of song. Culturally, we try to figure out how to connect people to it. After all, Showboat, the big show-stopping number is Old Man River. Can you imagine Old Man Mississippi River and Tributaries Authority? No. Mark Twain writing Life on the Clean Water Act? No. Yet that's the world we actually encounter when we go out there. And we have to actually now think about ways of understanding a river that is, in fact, a dynamic system, one that has needs and provides opportunities, that we serve with laws but do not artificially mask with laws. Because, as we've already acknowledged, rivers are dynamic, and so is most of human society, but the things that we write into law often are not. After all, we thought we had the natural flow doctrine. Why change it? Because society changed. That didn't mean legislatures did that. That was normally done through an evolutionary process in the courts. If you come from a tradition that doesn't believe judges make law, you're actually not in the right country. Common law is judge-made law. Water law is largely originally judge-made law. We've turned that into water codes in many, many states. We've overlain those with navigational authority, flood protection authorities, irrigation authorities, water supply authorities, fisheries management authorities, wildlife management authorities, all these things which are additive, but not necessarily pieces to the same puzzle. And that's what I want to suggest, that as we continue these conversations, not to be daunted by that history, it is what it is, but to understand it and respect it, because we're not the first to paint on this canvas, but it is a canvas that has to be repainted. So I think as we understand the nature of these uses, and there are many, and there will be more, that the one thing that we haven't, I think, can say that the current legal environment and policy environment governing the Mississippi River system, at least the main stem, is that it's one that there is largely a shared legal heritage. It's a heritage that is oriented to the use of water in the place where the water is. It's not inherently good or bad, and out west it's definitely not the legal tradition. But I think if we're really talking about how we bring people back to the river, we have to understand, again, the lens through which states, local governments, and most private and public property rights are construed. So what I wanted to point out to you is that as we look at those many, many needs, and as the General noted yesterday, there isn't enough water currently for all of them. We've gotten to the point where there is, in fact, competition. And it doesn't mean that there's not water for all of them in some way. It will just have to be managed differently, in some instances prioritized differently, including the role of nature in this. I'm not going to, this is not an abstract notion. I think, as Jerry Galloway noted yesterday, the new principles and requirements essentially talk about in-stream flow needs. Well, in-stream flow for what? Are we talking about the needs of the Gulf of Mexico and the oceans of the world in this? We need to be, but it's hard to put a metric on it. It's very difficult to put a metric for something like nutrient standards, as is it for the river that we have now, or the river that we need for the future. Right now, the river bypasses much of its traditional floodplain. Do nutrients benefit that floodplain or harm that floodplain if we put it back? Those are challenges that, quite frankly, we're going to have to consider, but we can't be hamstrung by. So that's what I'm going to suggest to you is the framework that we need to investigate this from. Because also when you hear someone else at the table, the authority or the legal regime that they are working within may be different than the one you are working within. That doesn't make them wrong or smarter than you. It makes them essentially adherent. So understand that you may have not only the challenge of trying to understand the nature of water better, you may have to understand the management systems that currently govern it. It's not so long ago, in fact, we're talking about coastal restoration work. South Louisiana is being vital to the survival of this river system functionally. That a coastal collapse was not on the jurisdictional radar of any state agency anywhere or any federal agency. Somebody had to put it there. That was a civics challenge that was mounted by not just Louisiana interests, but people who understood that the loss of that delta compromised something valuable to the entire United States. That's the kind of mindset I think it's going to require as we go forward. Because these are legal challenges, but they should not be viewed as legal straitjackets. Laws change to serve people. It shouldn't be the other way around. They also provide opportunities, ones that we hadn't foreseen. Now, I know that at an earlier meeting, we talked a little bit about compacts, and in your materials, there's a marvelous paper that, actually, William Faulkner wrote, but I put my name on. A few more, a little bit change in punctuation. But here in Chicago, as you sit out and look out on Lake Michigan, it's impossible to think about, what a management system, a multi-state, multi-stakeholder, federal natural resource management program can look like if it doesn't involve something more formal, like a compact. Now, a compact is nothing more than an agreement among states that has been sanctioned by the federal government. Why does the federal government have to sanction it? Because the Constitution says so. We have something called the Compact Clause, which prohibits states from making their own deals on anything of national significance. The Confederacy tried that and it didn't work, as you could see. But I think you also have to understand that the Great Lakes Compact is something which is currently still being worked out. They worked on it, they passed it, now they're trying to find out what it means to live with. Because it means that places like Waukesha, Wisconsin, can no longer get Great Lakes water for municipal supply unless you can get all the governors of the Great Lakes states to agree. About a 30-mile drive from Waukesha to Lake Michigan. It's not the equivalent of, water to Colorado. But legally it is. Those are the kinds of things we have to think about. What does water need to do? We also have to be aware that you can memorialize nonsense as easily, if not easier, than you can memorialize wisdom. So give it some thought. Don't reach for the tool until you know what the job is. Also realize that there are many laws in place that can be used more flexibly. I still tend to think that had the Mississippi River and Tributaries Authority been more expansively interpreted, 25 years ago, might not have needed to have passed the Coastal Wetlands Planning, Protection, and Restoration Act to pursue coastal restoration in Louisiana. After all, the inundation of 1 million acres or more of land by water looks like a flood to most people. Legally, it did not, because the water did not come from the sky or a river. That was the jurisdictional call, the interpretive call made by the Army Corps of Engineers at the time. Now we have to actually try to put the MR&T and the coastal program together in a functional world. It didn't necessarily have to be that way. That was, in many ways, an interpretive call governed by culture and history more than any legal necessity. But we're also seeing a trend, I think, in the other direction, because compacts are hard work. They can be put together, but you have to get everyone to agree. And as we're now watching our friends in Georgia, Florida, and Alabama learn with the Apalachicola-Chattahoochee-Flint dispute, it's awfully hard to do. They've actually had compacts that led to frustration, to years of inaction, and litigation when they ultimately failed. So if you don't have a common purpose, even if your motives are different, it's very difficult to put together a contract. You know that in your daily life. You go up to the McDonald's, order a hamburger, but you don't intend to pay, and they think that's a term of the deal, you're not going to make a deal that day. You're not going to walk away with your hamburger because your objectives are too different and your motives are too different. You can't make it happen. We have to understand that that's also the case when you get into these large river systems. But what you can do is use, I think, the existing framework of water supply authorities, flood protection authorities, irrigation authorities, and traditional water law, which again, for the main stem, is exclusively riparian. And riparian law orients public and private rights and duties around flowing water. If you don't know what riparian law said, it's very simple. It was if you owned property next to the river, you did not own the river, you could use it. You could not spoil it, but you could use it. And over time, we said you can spoil it a little so you can build that plant and create those jobs and build that city. But you still have duties not to unreasonably injure the folks downstream. And you may have duties as a steward because it's a public thing. The water itself was unownable. Keep in mind, property rights are pretty important, but it's not just private property rights. Public property rights matter too. Because not only do they limit what may be doable, in private hands, but they create public duties. You need to remember those. Because we discussed a little yesterday, I don't think there's anything that philosophically says you shouldn't share these water resources with other parts of America or even the world that want it. It may be the right thing to do. It may be the strategically critical thing to do. But if you don't know what you have to share, probably an unwise thing to do. If you don't know what surplus is, if you don't know what your future needs are, or if you're defining them so narrowly, be ready for a surprise. That is what led to the Great Lakes Compact. It was the prospect of the lakes being turned into mines for international export that prompted the Great Lakes states to come to an agreement restricting out-of-basin transfers. Certainly they were concerned about other parts of the United States wanting that water, but it was the imminent appearance of tankers from around the globe that prompted them to say, if you have ideas and money, bring them here. Don't take our water to feed, essentially, to grow your garden. Water is a blessing. And again, riparian law is based upon the notion that it is. That's why real estate next to rivers was more expensive, because it came with access and use. The guy behind your riparian lot didn't have that, and his property was worth less. And not cosmically right or wrong, but it was the way our traditions set it up. We can use that as a basis for at least beginning to orient ourselves around the river. Because riparian states don't have to begin by saying, gee, do we have a duty to send water to wherever anybody wants it for any purpose? We've already answered that question. It was answered for us by essentially those people who founded these states and, in fact, this nation. That's news to some people, especially out west. And if you don't know it, Texas and Oklahoma are heading to the Supreme Court in a couple of weeks to argue over the Red River. They even have a compact. The one thing I'll promise you is that the conversation will be, we used to argue and fight about water, but then we got a compact. Now we argue and fight about what the compact says. The good news is lawyers are being paid by all sides in this, and it's the way God wanted it.